The hospital hallways were unusually quiet for a Tuesday night, the hum of distant monitors, and the occasional shuffle of rubber soles on linoleum, the only sounds breaking the silence. Nurse Vanessa Carter glanced at the clock hanging above the nurse's station. Her shift had ended 30 minutes ago, but she hadn't been able to bring herself to leave just yet. Vanessa was exhausted. 12-hour shifts had a way of wearing a person down, and lately she'd been picking up extra hours whenever she could. Bills were piling up at home, and with her younger sister, Lily, relying on her, she didn't have the luxury of turning down overtime. Still, exhaustion wasn't the reason she was hesitating to walk out the door tonight. Room 407. She had passed by it multiple times throughout her shift, and each time she had seen the same sight. An elderly man, frail and tired, staring out the window at nothing in particular. He had been admitted 2 days ago, complications from pneumonia, but from the way he looked at the world, Vanessa suspected his body wasn't the only thing that was tired. Something about him reminded her of her grandfather, a man she had lost years ago. When she had checked his chart earlier, she had seen his name James Whitmore. And when she had spoken to him briefly that afternoon, his voice had been kind but distant, as if he had already made peace with being alone. Vanessa sighed, rubbing her temples. She should go home. Lily was probably waiting up for her, and she had an early shift tomorrow. But as she walked past room 407 one last time, she caught sight of James again, still sitting there, still staring out the window. Something in her chest tightened. She knocked softly on the doorframe. "Mr. Whitmore." James turned his head slowly, his pale blue eyes meeting hers with mild surprise. "You're still here?" His voice was quiet, measured. Vanessa stepped inside, offering a small smile. "Yes, I'm about to leave. Just wanted to check in on you before I go." She hesitated for a moment before pulling up a chair beside his bed. "Would you like some company for a bit?" James studied her for a moment before nodding. "That would be nice." She settled in, folding her hands in her lap. "Do you have any family coming to visit?" A shadow passed over his face, but he shook his head. "No, not anymore." Vanessa didn't push. Instead, she let the silence settle between them for a moment before speaking again. "Well, I can stay for a little while, if you don't mind me rambling about my day." To her surprise, James let out a soft chuckle. "I'd like that." And so, she talked. She told him about the chaos in the emergency room earlier, about the patient who had insisted his broken wrist was just a scratch, about the cafeteria running out of coffee again, which, in her opinion, should be a crime in a hospital. James listened, really listened, and when he spoke, it wasn't about himself but about life. He told her stories about his younger days, about the world before it became so fast-paced, about the love of his life, Margaret, whom he had lost years ago. "I never thought I'd outlive everyone," he admitted after a while, his voice quieter now. "It's a strange thing, getting old." Vanessa swallowed the lump in her throat. She reached out, placing a gentle hand over his. "You're not alone, Mr. Whitmore." He looked at her then, and for the first time that night, there was something in his eyes besides exhaustion. Gratitude. They sat together for another hour before Vanessa finally stood to leave. "I'll check in on you tomorrow, okay?" James nodded. "I'd like that." As she walked out of the hospital that night, the exhaustion still clung to her, but it felt different. Lighter, somehow. She didn't know it yet, but that small act of kindness would change everything. The next evening, Vanessa found herself back at James Whitmore's door, a cup of warm tea in her hand. The hospital's vending machine options were awful, but she had managed to bring a decent blend from home. James was sitting up in bed, his frail hands folded neatly over the blanket. He looked surprised when he saw her. "You came back," he said. Vanessa handed him the tea. "Told you I would." He accepted it slowly, the warmth seeming to comfort him more than the tea itself. As he took a careful sip, she pulled up the chair beside his bed again. "How was your day?" she asked. James let out a quiet breath. "Same as yesterday, a lot of waiting, a lot of thinking." Vanessa nodded. She had seen it happen many times before elderly patients left alone with nothing but their memories. Some grew bitter, others resigned, but James seemed to sit peacefully with his past. "Tell me something good from your life," she encouraged. James took a moment to think. "Margaret," he finally said, his voice soft. "She was the best part of it all." Vanessa leaned in, listening. "I met her when I was 22, James continued. "She was working at a bookstore. I walked in looking for a novel, but found her instead." A faint smile appeared on his face. "I must have bought 10 books that first month just for an excuse to see her." Vanessa chuckled. "Did she notice?" "Oh, she noticed, and she made me work for it, but when she finally agreed to have dinner with me, I knew." His fingers brushed the side of the teacup as if holding onto something invisible. "We had 65 good years together." Vanessa could hear the love in his voice, even decades later. "She sounds wonderful." She was. He took another sip of tea, then set the cup down. "And now it's just me." The weight of those words lingered in the air. Vanessa hesitated before speaking. "You know, I think people like to believe that being alone means being forgotten, but I don't think that's true." James looked at her, waiting. "As long as someone remembers you, as long as someone listens to your stories, you're still here," she said. "Margaret is still here, too, because you keep her in your heart." James studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. "Maybe you're right." They sat in comfortable silence for a while after that. As the days passed, Vanessa continued to visit him after her shifts. It became a quiet routine. She'd bring him tea, and he'd share pieces of his life with her. He spoke of the house he and Margaret had built, the road trips they had taken, the little traditions they had kept. Sometimes he asked about her life too. "You're young," he remarked one evening. "You work hard. What do you want for yourself?" Vanessa hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. "Right now, I'm just trying to take care of my sister. She's in college, and I want to make sure she has everything she needs." James nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good thing. Family is a good thing." Vanessa smiled. "Yeah, it is." As the days turned into weeks, James seemed to gain a quiet comfort in her visits. He began to wait for her, eyes lighting up when she walked in. He asked her about her day, listened when she vented about difficult patients, and even gave her advice when she worried about things. And then, one evening, everything changed. Vanessa arrived at his room to find it empty. The bed was made, the machine silent. A sinking feeling settled in her chest. She turned to a nearby nurse. "Where's Mr. Whitmore?" The nurse looked at her with sympathy. "He passed this morning." Vanessa stood there for a moment, the words settling in. She had known it would happen eventually. His body had been weak, and he had spoken like a man who had already made peace with his life. But knowing it was coming didn't make it any easier. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. He hadn't been alone. That was what mattered. And yet, as she walked out of the hospital that night, the world felt quieter than before. Vanessa sat in her small apartment, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Lily was at the library studying for an exam, leaving Vanessa alone with her thoughts. James' absence had settled into her chest like a weight she couldn't quite shake. She had tried to push it aside, to focus on work, but every time she passed his now empty room, the ache returned. She had known him for only a few weeks, yet he had left an impression that felt permanent. It wasn't just his stories or the way he'd listened to hers, it was the way he had made her feel seen. In a hospital filled with people, Vanessa often felt like just another exhausted body moving through the motions. But James had asked about her life, her dreams. He had cared. The sound of a car pulling up outside broke her from her thoughts. She frowned, standing up to peek through the window. A sleek black vehicle, polished to perfection, was parked in front of the building. It was the kind of car that didn't belong in this part of town, where most people drove older, well-worn vehicles. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket before making his way to her door. He carried a leather briefcase and moved with the kind of confidence that suggested he had never once questioned where he belonged. Vanessa's stomach tightened. She had no idea who he was, but something told her this wasn't a casual visit. A firm knock echoed through the apartment. Taking a steadying breath, she opened the door. "Vanessa Carter?" the man asked, his tone polite but formal. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "My name is Daniel Pierce. I'm the executor of James Whitmore's estate." Vanessa blinked. His estate. Daniel nodded. "May I come in?" She stepped aside, still trying to process what was happening. He entered, his eyes briefly scanning the modest living space before settling on her again. "I understand that Mr. Whitmore's passing was recent. I'm sorry for your loss." Vanessa nodded, unsure of what to say. Daniel set his briefcase on the small kitchen table and unlatched it. "I won't take up much of your time, but it's important that we go over a few things." Vanessa pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "I don't understand. Why are you here?" Daniel retrieved a stack of documents. "Mr. Whitmore included you in his final arrangements." She froze. "What?" Daniel adjusted his glasses. He left instructions regarding a portion of his estate. Specifically, he wanted to ensure that you were taken care of. Vanessa shook her head. "That doesn't make sense. I was just a nurse who sat with him for a few nights. I didn't do anything special." Daniel glanced at her, his expression unreadable. It seems Mr. Whitmore disagreed. The room felt suddenly too small, the air too thick. She had never expected anything in return for the time she had spent with James. She had done it because he had been alone, because she had wanted to. The idea that he had made arrangements for her, she didn't know how to feel. "What exactly did he leave?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Daniel tapped the documents. "We'll discuss the details soon, but I wanted to meet you in person first. James spoke very highly of you." Vanessa swallowed. "He did." Daniel nodded. "He didn't have much family left, and from what I gathered, you were one of the few people who truly cared in his final days." Vanessa looked down at the table. She wasn't sure what to say to that. Daniel closed his briefcase. "I'll be in touch soon with the full details. In the meantime, if you have any questions, here's my card." She took it hesitantly. As he stood to leave, he paused at the door. "He wanted you to know that your kindness didn't go unnoticed." Then he was gone, leaving Vanessa sitting in stunned silence. Vanessa sat at the kitchen table long after Daniel Pierce had left, staring at the card he had given her. The weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on her chest. James had left something for her, something significant enough that his lawyer had come in person. She couldn't wrap her mind around it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Lily stepped inside, dropping her bag next to the couch. "You're home early," she said, glancing at Vanessa. "Everything okay?" Vanessa looked up at her sister, still unsure how to put everything into words. "Do you remember Mr. Whitmore, the patient I used to visit?" Lily nodded as she grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge. "Yes, the older man you always talked about. Did something happen?" Vanessa exhaled. "He passed a few days ago, and today, his lawyer came to see me." Lily paused, the cap of the water bottle halfway twisted open. "His lawyer?" Vanessa nodded. "He left me something in his will. I don't know what yet, but it's apparently significant enough that his estate wanted to meet me in person." Lily's eyebrows shot up. "Wait, hold on, he left you something? Like money?" I don't know, Vanessa admitted, but it doesn't make any sense. I barely knew him. I was just a nurse who spent a little time with him before he passed. Lily sat down across from her, setting the water bottle aside. Vanessa, maybe that meant more to him than you realize. Vanessa traced the edge of the lawyer's card with her finger. I didn't do anything expecting a reward. I know, Lily said gently, but sometimes people just want to say thank you in their own way. The conversation lingered in Vanessa's mind for the next few days. She tried to focus on work, but every time she walked past room 407, she felt the absence of James more acutely. She missed their quiet conversations, the way he told stories about his life. It was strange how someone could enter her life so briefly and still leave such a lasting mark. Then, 4 days after Daniel's visit, her phone rang just as she was finishing her shift. She stepped outside the hospital before answering. Vanessa Carter, Daniel's voice came through the line. Yes, speaking. I have the final details regarding Mr. Whitmore's estate. Are you available to meet tomorrow morning? Vanessa's stomach tightened. Yes, I can be there. Good, I'll send you the address. It's important that this is handled in person. The next morning, Vanessa found herself standing in front of a towering brick building in the downtown district. It was the kind of office where everything felt pristine and expensive, a stark contrast to the hospital halls she was used to. She took a deep breath before stepping inside. Daniel was already waiting for her in a sleek conference room, a thick folder resting on the polished table. He gestured for her to sit before sliding the folder toward her. Mr. Whitmore made it clear in his final instructions that he wanted to show his gratitude for your kindness, Daniel began. He set aside a financial sum specifically for you. Vanessa hesitated before opening the folder. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes landed on the number written inside. $50,000, Daniel confirmed. She barely heard him. The number swam in front of her, too large, too unreal. This is a mistake, she finally whispered. Daniel shook his head. It's not. James wanted you to have this. He said your kindness in his final days gave him peace, and he wanted to do something meaningful in return. Vanessa swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edges of the folder. I don't know if I can accept this. Daniel leaned forward slightly. You already did, the moment you sat with him when no one else did. He made this decision knowing exactly what he wanted. There are no conditions, no strings attached. This is his way of saying thank you. Vanessa felt her chest tighten. She had never expected anything for staying with James, for simply listening to him. But now, sitting in this polished office, she realized just how much those moments had meant to him. She blinked back the sudden sting in her eyes. After a moment, she exhaled slowly. Okay. Daniel nodded. I'll handle the necessary paperwork, and the funds will be transferred to you within a few days. As she left the office, the weight of what had just happened settled over her. $25,000. It was more money than she had ever seen at once, and it would change everything. She could finally pay off the overdue bills. She could make sure Lily had everything she needed for school. For the first time in a long time, she could breathe. And it was all because she had stayed a little longer, sat with a lonely man, and listened. James had given her something far greater than money. He had given her proof that kindness mattered. Vanessa sat on the bus ride home, her thoughts a tangled mess of gratitude, disbelief, and quiet reflection. The envelope with the legal document sat firmly in her lap, and every so often, she ran her fingers over its edges just to remind herself that it was real. $50,000. The number still felt too large, too surreal. The city lights flickered outside the window as the bus rumbled through the streets. She had spent so long worrying about bills, about making sure Lily had what she needed, that she hadn't allowed herself to think about a future where she wasn't just scraping by. The weight that had sat on her chest for years felt lighter now. Not gone, but manageable. When she stepped into her apartment, Lily was already home, sprawled on the couch with a textbook open in front of her. She looked up as Vanessa walked in, and her brows pulled together in curiosity. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Lily observed. Vanessa set the envelope on the table and sat down beside it. "James left me $50,000. Lily's mouth fell open. "You're kidding." Vanessa shook her head. "It's real. His lawyer gave me the paperwork today. The money will be transferred soon." Lily pushed aside her textbook, fully focused now. "That's incredible. What are you going to do with it?" Vanessa exhaled, leaning back against the couch. "I don't know yet. I know I'll pay off the bills, and I want to make sure you don't have to stress about school, but beyond that." She trailed off, realizing she hadn't allowed herself to think beyond survival in years. Lily watched her thoughtfully. "You could do something for yourself, too." Vanessa let out a small laugh. "Like what?" "I don't know. Something that makes you happy." The idea felt foreign. Happiness had always been something she put on hold for later, after responsibilities were met, after Lily was secure. But maybe, for the first time, she could afford to consider it. Over the next few days, she took care of the immediate concerns. She paid off the overdue bills, watching as the weight of debt slowly lifted. She set aside a portion for Lily's tuition, ensuring her sister wouldn't have to worry about expenses for the next semester. And then, after everything practical had been handled, she sat down with herself and thought about what came next. One evening, as she walked home from a shift, she found herself stopping in front of a small bookstore tucked between two larger buildings. The sign above the door was faded, the window display simple but inviting. Something about it reminded her of the stories James had told her about Margaret, about how they had met in a place just like this. Without thinking, she stepped inside. The scent of old pages and fresh coffee filled the air. A woman behind the counter greeted her with a warm nod before turning back to a book she had been reading. Vanessa wandered through the aisles, running her fingers over the spines of books she had never had time to read. She wasn't sure how long she stood there before she realized something. She wanted this. Not just books, but a space like this. A place where people could gather, where stories could be shared, where someone like James could sit and find company in the pages of a novel or the warmth of conversation. The idea settled deep in her chest, and for the first time in years, she felt something close to excitement. The next morning, she called Daniel Pierce. "Is there anything else in James' estate?" she asked after they exchanged greetings. Daniel was quiet for a moment before responding. "Why do you ask?" Vanessa hesitated, then decided to be honest. He talked a lot about his past. There was a bookstore where he met his wife. I was just wondering if he had any connection to one now. Daniel paused. Actually, he did. It was a small property he held onto for sentimental reasons. It's been closed for some time, but it's still his. Vanessa gripped the phone tighter. What's going to happen to it? It was set to be sold, with the rest of his assets. She took a deep breath before speaking again. "Is there any way I could take over the lease?" Daniel sounded surprised. "You're interested in running it?" Vanessa nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I think I am." A few weeks later, she stood in front of the same bookstore, but this time, she wasn't just a visitor. The paperwork had been finalized, and with the money James had left her, she had secured the lease. The place needed work, but as she stepped inside and ran her hands over the worn wooden counter, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. "I hope." Lily walked in behind her, taking in the space with wide eyes. "Can't believe you're doing this." Vanessa smiled. "Neither can I." But as she looked around, she realized James had given her more than just financial relief. He had given her a future, one where she wasn't just surviving, but building something of her own. And for that, she would always be grateful.